Okay. Well, morning.
Good morning.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Welcome to Torah study on this cold December morning. But here we are. I have not been, it feels like a very long time since, we didn't have Torah study last week. And then 2 weeks prior to that, other people taught, and I was sitting in on the new member class. So I feel like it's been a very long time since I've been here. Yeah. So I've been trying to sit in on there just to hear some of the things they're talking about. They've been teasing me that I finally decided to be a member after 10 years. Being here for 10 years. There's a lot to talk about in this portion. And since we didn't have Torah study last week, I do want to go back and just kind of briefly go through last week's portion, because it, of course, sets up this week's. And like most portions in Genesis, there's just a ton that happens in every single one. We cover a lot of time in every portion, and we have just really significant foundational things happening. So I just want to briefly go back and talk about the portion that was last week. So last week's portion started in Genesis 25, verse 19, and goes through basically the first half of 28, and then we pick up in the middle of 28 for this week. So what's the big event that happened in last week's portion?
Sarah died.
Sarah died. But what happened with Jacob and Esau?
Oh, he cheated him out of his blessing and inheritance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, which I wish we had time to talk through that. It's always an interesting conversation to see how people view that. But of course we know that it was prophesied that the younger was going to get the birthright, but the way that comes about is a little bit challenging, because there's a lot of deception going on with both Jacob and with and even with Rebecca, making sure that then when we get to the blessing, because we've talked about in the past, we're not going to get into the depths of it today, because I do want us to spend more time on this week's portion, but that it does seem like birthright and blessing are related but separate, because it really could have happened that Jacob could have stolen the birthright, but Esau could have still gotten the firstborn blessing from Isaac. That would have made, I think, as complicated as this story is, I think that would have made it even more complicated. And so I think that it had to not happen that way, but it is a little bit of a tension that there's so much deception in how that comes about. But also in last week's portion, we do have this section in chapter 26, where the covenant is kind of confirmed with Isaac, which is something that we see with the patriarchs, that the covenant kind of gets restated in each generation. Isaac is also the only one who lives his whole life in the land, which is interesting. But we do see that covenantal transfer there. So then let's move to the end of that portion. So after all this has happened, and Jacob has secured basically both the birthright and the blessing from Isaac, Esau is not very happy with this situation, which I guess is understandable. His life would have been very different had he gotten what he felt was rightfully his. The whole biblical narrative would have been different had that happened differently. So Esau is not very happy, and Rebecca knows that. So we kind of end the portion with the setup, which makes sense because this is a narrative story. we kind of end with the setup for this week's portion, and that is that Isaac and Rebecca are saying Jacob cannot take a woman from the daughters of Canaan. We need to find a wife for him from somewhere else. And also, we're kind of afraid that Esau's going to kill him. So he probably needs to go away for a little bit and let Esau cool off, and then he can come back later. So that's kind of where we left last week's portion. Does anybody have any other comments or questions about anything about that before we jump into this week's portion? I know that's like the briefest overview ever, but that's, we gotta keep going. That's how it works. Okay, so, and of course Esau does marry from the daughters of Canaan from Ishmael's descendants, and so we see that line continuing in that side as well. Okay, so now we can jump into this week's portion, which starts in Genesis 28, verse 10, and goes all the way through 31. So, nice chunk here. So what's interesting about this portion is that it kind of covers the whole time that Jacob is gone from the land, basically. And there's a lot that happens in that time, of course. So I do want us to take some time starting out with this first section, which is starting in chapter 28, verse 10 through the end of chapter 28. This is one of the, more famous Bible story type passages, I guess you could say. This is Jacob's ladder. So what happens? What's the point of this? What is going on in at this Jacob's ladder situation, I guess?
Well, it's reconfirming the covenant, but now it's going on to the third generation. And I found it really interesting. I guess I hadn't noticed it before. When the Lord appears before him, he says, "I am Adonai, the God of your father Abraham," although Abraham was his grandfather, and the God of Isaac. So he's letting him know, there's this generational thing, and now it's Jacob's turn to make that choice. But he's reconfirming with him things that Jacob probably should have already known if it was getting passed on. But we've got the promise of the land, the promise of the seed, and the blessing. So we have that covenant in there again.
So it's repeating. We've talked about a lot. And just what Lori's saying is that we have these three parts to the Abrahamic covenant: land, seed, and blessing, and they get repeated. Each generation. So this is in effect Jacob's turn. So I think it's interesting too that this is kind of as Jacob is getting ready to leave the land for a while. That he's saying before he gets out of the land of Canaan that we know that he's going to come back to, God is like, I am going to give this land to your seed.
Yeah, prior to this, he believed Abraham must have told him about the promises and their interaction with God, but Jacob had never met God himself, right? This is the first time where he actually comes into a personal relationship.
Right, exactly. With God. Which is part of the important principle I think that we see because I think in other how do I want to say this? I mean, ancient tradition would have been, you have a household idol, which comes into our story a little bit later in this portion. We have some issues with some household idols that have to be dealt with. But that's tradition that gets passed down. They don't have this encounter, this personal encounter with God. But in this situation with the God of Israel, he does personally appear, and we continue to see that he appears through every generation, right? Like that's part of the significance is that his presence, and he speaks through every generation, whether it's through, at this point, a family, later to Moses, to a nation, to Joshua, to the judges, to the prophets, to the, but it's how he appears and how he speaks through each generation shifts a bit, but of course, ultimately culminating in the coming of Yeshua and the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, but his presence is manifest in some way in every generation. Yes.
So one of the things I was noticing, because so much, I've been thinking just a whole lot about the, yes, we've got that thread in the story, but how critical their decisions were for, like it says, and in you, all the families of the earth would be blessed.
Right.
So his decisions that he's making right now, not only is about the covenant for that people to carry on, but their decisions affect the rest of the world.
Right.
So this is like a pretty huge thing. It's not only just, hey, I'm going to bless your family and you
right.
guys are going to multiply, but the Lord keeps reiterating this through you and your seed. You're going to bless the families of the earth.
Right.
So it is that bigger calling that they have,
yes.
that they're also saying yes to,
right.
when they pursue this.
Right, and we have this interesting vantage point right now, thousands of years later.
Mm-hmm.
We are still seeing the generational implications of this, because think back to Abraham. We see the generational implication of the fact that he tried to force the covenant and that he had Ishmael with Hagar, and then Isaac. We see the tension in two people groups still, right?
It's all a pattern to teach us, right? These things were written for our instruction, as
right.
in Romans. So you can still commit the sin of Esau and not value the inheritance of being born again and sell your inheritance. It's like
right.
for a bowl of bread stew.
Right, and at the same time, the intention of the family was that Ishmael and Esau would still be worshiping God. Like, right, this is one of the things that we're praying for. Like, we want all nations, and that includes the nations that have descended from Ishmael and Esau. Asher Intrader has some great teachings and some great conversations with David Damien, who's, I believe he's an Egyptian believer, about how Jew and Arab, like the idea is for them to come together and worship God together as brothers, and that's a very tense situation. And I don't want us to get all the way into all of that.
That's a cross they're reconciled, right?
Yes.
She was cross they're reconciled.
Yes, but that recognition, we're still working towards that.
Yeah.
But the point is that the goal is for everybody to still be part of God's family, right? And so, but like what you're saying is this all the families of the earth will be blessed. In Ephesians 2, it talks about that, even of saying,
Gentiles are without God, separate from God, separate from the covenants of Israel,
yes.
with no hope.
So this is a theme all the way through, and this is really the root of where we see the calling of Israel is what? What's Israel's role on the planet?
To be a blessing to the nations.
To be a blessing and a light to the nations. So this is really the root of that, right? This is not Israel yet. This is just a family. We don't have a nation of Israel yet. But the implication and the point of this covenant is that this family becomes a nation that is a light to the nations, and through that, every family, that's how everyone gets to come and worship God, right? So it's interesting to like you're saying, like there's generational implications, and those covenants and those promises don't go away based on the behavior of the nations, of Israel, and the people. They stay. There's consequences, and that's where we start to see, especially like if you read Kings and Chronicles, you see this very quick back and forth. This king was faithful and Israel was blessed and multiplied. This king was unfaithful. He rebuilt the high places. He rebuilt the temples of the pagan gods, and they were cast out. It's like a tennis match, almost back and forth for a while with some of the kings of Israel. But there's always a faithful remnant, and God still keeps His promises because remember, because that's going back to that Abrahamic covenant of why God is the one who passes through the animals and makes the covenant that He's not going to break this covenant with Israel. So this Jacob's ladder is Jacob's kind of encounter or with God Himself, which he's going to have more. Of course, we have it. I think it's in next week's portion. Yeah, that he, the one where he wrestles with God and his name gets changed, which is a great story.
You've got the ifs in there too, like,
Yeah.
you never saw Abraham or Isaac say, well, if you do this,
Right.
then you will be my God.
Mm-hmm.
You do see Jacob doing
Right.
that in this encounter.
Right.
He's testing the Lord more on, if you do this for me.
Right.
Now, I know there's kind of like this, not like the in-your-face challenge, it probably gets a little bit lost in translation, but you still don't see Abraham and Isaac putting the conditions for a relationship
Right.
the way Jacob, I felt like, put more of a condition
Yeah.
for a relationship.
Yeah, which is really interesting, and because he does kind of put that challenge of like, hey, I need you to prove this, which goes back to the interesting thing of like, it makes me wonder, because again, Genesis really is kind of like the highlight reel of all of this,
Yeah.
right? Like there's just a lot of information we don't have, but it makes me wonder like what his experience, like what he did, what he heard from Isaac. You know, like how Isaac explained this covenant, his covenantal encounter with Jacob, and how he explained Abraham's, you know, like to make him challenge that, if there's something in that, or if it's just, I think that there's also this something in us that needs our own experience with God. And I think that's still true, like, right? Like that's why I was like, we each have to declare that Yeshua is Lord, right? Like somebody can't do it for you.
Sure. Yeah, when I read this week, I was thinking maybe that's what Yeshua was mentioning when he said, don't worry about what you're going to eat or what you're going to drink, right? It was the flesh always does. But here, Jacob is on his own now for the first time. He always relied on his family's money.
Right, and he's fleeing for his life.
Yeah.
So this is a different situation than what Abraham and Isaac had. And he's actually really going with nothing. You know, like there's wealth been accumulated in the family so far, but Jacob isn't taking any of that with him. Like Jacob, he's really just they're really just trusting like he's gonna make it to Laban and his family's gonna take care of him.
Sure.
Which is a scary place to be. And that turns out kind of interesting. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But so he really is in this so it really is a little bit more. He's in a situation that tests the Lord a little bit more. It's like, okay, I know what you've said, but now one, I'm leaving the land, and two, I'm leaving this land that you promised, and two, there's like, I'm actively being sought to be killed. So I need to know how this works now. So, real quick before I'm going to skip over if I can find the right spot. I don't remember if I put it in my notes or not, or if I just thought about it. This could be dangerous. Well, while I'm looking for this, one other thing is that's really interesting about this story is, does it remind you of any other Stairway to Heaven story in the Bible?
That when the Daniel sees Jesus under the fig tree, and then they bring him before, was it John chapter 2 or John chapter 1?
Okay, I'm thinking the one in the Torah that we've already read in the Torah so far this year. It's previously in Genesis. Where it's a kind of a reversal story, where previously all the people on the earth were trying to build the Tower of Babel, which is really interesting. I'm like, really? We know, like, I mean, it's a very different situation, of course, but it's just interesting that that would happen, and the result of that is that God scatters the people across the face of the earth, right, and separates their language and forces the commandment to multiply and fill the earth, because they weren't doing that. And now, because in that sense, like building this tower up to heaven was this kind of power trip for the people, right? But now God kind of appears on this stairway, and it's how he appears to Jacob. I don't know what to make of that connection. I just think it's really interesting. Like, I read that and I'm like, this is so interesting that this is how he chose to do this, right?
No, it's like the first temptation is from the devil that you can become like God if you eat from this tree, right? And so that's pride. That's what caused him to fall. He wanted to be God. But then there's the opposite action where actually God wants us to be like him, right? He wants us to be Christ-like. So he wants to transform us into his nature and into his ways of thinking, but he doesn't want us to arrogantly want to take his place.
Right. Yeah, we're supposed to be in the likeness of God, but in a submission to God, not in a I am God type of way. Okay, so let's go back. So keeping in mind, Jacob has this encounter with God at the place where he names Bethel or Bethel, the house of God, basically. And he sets up this memorial stone, and he makes these kind of if statements. If you do this, God, I will worship you, basically. So then, we're going to skip the middle of the story for a minute. We'll come back. We flip over to chapter 31. And this, of course, is after everything has happened with Laban. He's worked ultimately 14 years for these two wives when he was really only trying to get one. All these children, all this stuff that we'll go back and talk about here in a minute. This whole thing with the goats, which is interesting. And he decides he leaves, right? And Laban kind of hunts him down. Or well, this is before Laban hunts him down. But he leaves with his wives and his children and his livestock. He goes back. He's like, all right, it's time for us to go. And so then in chapter 31, let's look at verse 11. It says, then the angel of God said to me in a dream, Jacob, and I said, Hineni. He said, lift up your eyes and see that all the males going up to the flocks are striped, spotted, and speckled, for I have seen everything Laban has done to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a memorial stone, and where you made a vow to me. Get up now and leave this land and return to the land of your relatives. So this is God telling Jacob it's time to go. And basically reminding him, remember that encounter that we had? I remember when you said, if you do this, I will worship you. We did all those things. You know, and so this is God's reminder of like, all right, I am who I said I am, and I've done all this. I've seen everything that's happened to you, and it's time for you to go back home so that I can fulfill this covenant and give this land to your people. So it's kind of cool that we get to see that kind of fulfillment and that kind of answer in this same portion. Okay, so let's go back, pick up some of this complicated stuff that we skipped. So after he has this encounter with God, he moves on and he goes and he finds Laban's family. And of course he sees Rachel and decides that is the one that I want. So the agreement, because again, Jacob's kind of has left his family with nothing, right? So he doesn't have the bride price, right? Because that was the custom at the time. If you want to marry someone, there's this business deal basically of money, animals, land, whatever, for you to be allowed to marry her. Jacob doesn't have anything to offer, so he agrees. He and Laban work out this deal, and Laban, of course. It's interesting to read commentaries on this passage because Laban hasn't really done anything yet at this point, but all the commentaries still make him out to be this really like deceitful, conniving man, which he is, but it's like really funny, like the things that he does later like foreshadows like even the commentators like when they from this very first moment when it's like we don't really know his motives right now.
But so is Rebecca, his brother, right, or his sister, and so is
Uh-huh.
Jacob. They're all manipulators, right?
They are. So anyway, but at this point, Jacob sees Rachel, and he wants to marry her, and they work out this agreement that he's going to work 7 years for Laban to be able to marry Rachel. So he does. He fulfills that. But then at the wedding feast, he ends up with Leah and not Rachel, which it's funny. It's fun to read some commentaries on all of this because it talks about, because we're always like, how would he not know it's a different woman? You know?
And it happens over and over.
I know. Right? I know. It's like, how do you not know this isn't the woman that you wanted? And it's interesting to read some of the theories on this, and some of them are just that he was drunk. They were having a wedding feast and he was drunk, so he wasn't really aware, which is possible, probably part of the story. But then they also point out it's because, so think back to when Jacob kind of gets the firstborn blessing from Isaac. How is he able to trick Isaac? Disguise. And what about Isaac made it possible?
His eyes were bad.
Yeah, he couldn't see. And so now it's like this interesting, a lot of the commentators draw this parallel of like, so he ends up with Leah instead of Rachel. It's kind of this
Sowing and reaping.
a little bit of like,
And Leah couldn't see well, they say, right?
right. Well, yeah, and there's different ideas of what does it say? Her eyes are soft or her delicate, or they're weak. Different translations put it in different ways, so it's interesting. There's some discussion about what that actually means too, but the point is that in the dark, and especially if he's somewhat inebriated, and of course they don't have electricity, so it's actually really dark at night. That he doesn't know, but it's partially that he can't see, that he doesn't recognize that he's with a
And
different
Laban was
woman.
probably running interference.
Huh?
Laban was probably running interference with his family.
Sure, yeah, and it's also interesting that a lot of the assumption also is that Leah was in on it. Because
how could you not be?
yeah, and that it's, well, depending on how you understand if women had much choice in all of this or not, it's hard to say. But it does seem that she was, because the assumption is that she didn't say a whole lot. She tried to keep quiet so that they wouldn't,
Sure. I'm sure in 7
You know.
years Jacob talked to Rachel and said, I'm gonna marry you one day. So it had to be known amongst the.
Well, yeah, they had to know it, and
But the father could have lied to her and said, no, I made a deal with Jacob to marry you first.
it's possible. Yeah, we don't. Again, there's a lot we don't know, but we're seeing. But this is where we're starting to see Laban's character coming out. But regardless, Jacob ends up with a wife that's not the one that he wants, but he still wants the one that he wants. So he makes another deal with Laban. I will work 7 more years for Rachel, the one I wanted in the first place. And the interesting thing about that is that this time, so Jacob must have been pretty trustworthy, because he doesn't work the 7 years first. I think I always grew up like kind of hearing the story, and it's like he works 7 years for Leah, then he works another 7 years, and then he gets Rachel. But that's not what it says. It says, this is chapter 29, verse 26. Laban said, it's not done so in our place to give the younger before the firstborn. Complete the bridal week for this one, and then we'll give you the other for work that you'll do with me another 7 years. So Jacob did. He also completed this one's bridal week, and then he gave him his daughter Rachel to be his wife. So he marries her a week later. It's really interesting. And then he works another 7 years. So that's kind of an interesting thing too. So that, like, I don't know if Laban knew in the beginning that he was going to get 14 years of work out of Jacob, but for this whole deal, but ultimately Jacob ends up working for 14 years for 2 wives. And then the story, and then of course everything continues to get more complicated. So, okay, let's see here. Here we go. All these wives and children, here we go. So, now we get into this interesting tension because, of course, we've already well established Rachel's the one he wants, Leah's not. Poor woman. And their rivalry and their different standings with their husband come out strongly in this narrative of their children. So, starts out, because it says that in verse 31 of chapter 29, now Adonai saw that Leah was unloved, so he opened her womb, but Rachel was unable to conceive. So, we see, even though there's all this deception, the Lord kind of has compassion.
That's one of the translations I have. It's not Adonai saw, but it's Adonai had compassion on her.
Yeah. So Adonai's compassion for Leah, and seeing that she's unloved, he opens her womb. And we have lots of these, and the Lord opens her womb stories, right? With Sarah and Rebecca, and now with Leah, and ultimately with Rachel. Part of that is, which we'll see a little bit more as we continue through this story, is that there's lots of superstition at this time about how you conceive children, which when we, a little bit later in chapter 30, we get into the mandrakes and stuff like that. So there's all this, but God is stating over and over again that he is the one who opens the womb, regardless of anything else that these people are trying to do. Which again, that's one of the main purposes of Torah, is to show that the God of Israel is categorically and remarkably different than any other God of any other nation at the time. So this is part of his showing that he really is the God of all creation, and not just a territorial God or family God or whatever. He is God.
I think for me, the end of chapter 29 of Leah's four births, the progression of that, is probably one of my favorite parts of this whole story, because you see the levels, like what she names each son, when she goes first from Reuben, who it's the God who sees me. Then she gives birth to Simeon, it's the God that hears me, basically, the Shema word. And then Levi, which means now maybe there's an attachment there, because Levi is to attach. Then you have Judah, praise, who then of course that compassion and that relationship with Leah, I feel like the Lord so honors that of course through the tribe of Judah we get the Messiah.
Right.
So there's just this, she may have felt, set apart, but it just shows like this huge level of relationship she was building with the Lord that her husband wasn't giving her.
Right.
And ultimately out of that comes that line that comes forth in Messiah. And I just think that's a really beautiful portrayal of growing into acknowledging these levels of relationship.
Right. I think that's a really good way to say it, of seeing that progression. And yeah, it is interesting that, from her sons we do get the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Levi, who become who?
Priests.
The priests. The ones who are in service in the tabernacle and the temple. So, so it's interesting. I do like at the very end of 29, when she said she became pregnant again and gave birth to a son and said, "This time I praise Adonai." Does kind of signify that she has learned that having all these children to try to earn the love of her husband is not working, but she is seen by God, and that is enough, really. So yeah, that is an interesting progression, and I'm glad you brought up what all those names mean, because names, of course, are in the Bible are important. So we see a lot with that too. So then we have poor Rachel here. So Rachel, of course, has the love of her husband, but she has no children. So so this is interesting. In Dennis Prager's commentary, he kind of begins his commentary on this chapter with an essay called "Is Life Meaningless Without Children?" And he talks all about how it's common, coming less common, which is something he comments on as well, that not having children is seen as one of the worst states that possible. And if he even says, at times, particularly in ancient times, life without children has been deemed essentially worthless, even tantamount to death. And so it's like, which, thinking in ancient culture, I can kind of see that, because really, if you have no children, particularly you have no sons, that's not going to be a good thing for you. Your life's going to be a little hard at some point, because sons are who the inheritance is passed through, and they're expected to, your sons are expected to grow up and take care of your elderly parents.
No Medicaid, no Social Security.
Right. So it's really their society really relies on the younger generation taking care of the older. So if you have no children, it's not great for you as you age.
Was it seen as a curse?
Mm-hmm.
Also,
yeah. So that goes back to one of the reasons why it's so significant that it continually says in this storyline, but in others as well, that God is the one who opens the womb. So there does become a wrestle too of like, so if you serve God but he doesn't give you children, does that mean he's cursing you? I don't think we can draw that conclusion either. But especially in the ancient culture, because they're like, that's what I briefly mentioned, and we can talk about more in a little bit, this whole thing with the mandrakes and stuff like that. There's this idea that you can have these superstitions or please whatever God you're serving, and they're going to give you children. So this is a common thing, is that it relies on the favor of some God, some deity or being somewhere to have children, and that's a really important thing.
They still believe that big time during the book of Jeremiah.
Mm-hmm.
That was a huge wrestle he was having
Mm-hmm.
with the Israelites, is that the women were still partaking in these pagan practices
Mm-hmm.
to conceive, and they believed that if we don't do this, we're not going to be able to have kids.
Yeah.
And they were refusing to follow Jeremiah when Jeremiah's lead, when he said, stop it, stop doing this practice, stop, offering to this. And they were like, no, because if we do, we won't have kids. So it's not like that stopped.
Right.
Even the giving of the Torah didn't stop
Right.
them from superstitions about trying to conceive.
Mm-hmm.
It was huge for a woman's value to be able to produce children for
Right.
her husband.
Right, yeah, which proves kind of Dennis Prager's point about the significance of having children. And he also talks about, but if we serve God, like that can't be everything. Not that it's bad to desire children. Like that's it's not a bad desire at all. But this idea that basically you're dead if you have no children is not in line with serving the Lord. He says that thinking that way it would mean that if we have no children, all the good things we do, all the good we do is worthless. All the love we experience is pointless, and nothing but a child, not even God, let alone a spouse, friends, work, religion, service to others, passions makes life meaningful. So he's pointing out, like, yes, children are a blessing, and he talks about frequently, like, people should want to have children, but if you don't have children, it doesn't mean that your life doesn't have meaning. And really, this shift towards, especially in the Western world, of not having children or delayed having children is actually a problem. Because if generations, because it even goes back to, like, yes, we do have like Stan was mentioning, some of these social programs to care for and provide, support for people as they age. But really, you still have to have people to care for them. So if generations aren't replacing themselves, then you have a large population of people who need care and no one to care for them. And that's a dangerous situation. So he points out the danger of this mindset, this Western mindset that people are not wanting to have children.
Well, in the old covenant, that's your name for preserved. It's your family line. If you die without any male children, that's it. You cease from the earth. In the new covenant, we could make spiritual children, right? Jesus wants us to multiply believers and born again seed.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
So his testimony doesn't disappear from the earth.
Yeah. For
that
sure.
was a concern Abraham had when he brought it up
Right.
with the Lord.
Right.
I don't have any kids here.
Right.
Do I make Eleazar my?
Right.
Yeah. So.
Right. Yeah. And again, going back to what we're saying, is like we even see we're seeing the generational implications, good and bad, of Abraham's life, even now. And so, and this is one of the biggest testimonies to the existence and the faithfulness of God is that the Jewish people exist.
Yeah.
Because if you read any bit of history, part of the point has been to wipe out the Jewish people. Of any major conflict in the world.
Why do you think that God didn't bless the Abraham's efforts with Ishmael, right? But then he does bless Rachel and Leah's efforts of giving Jacob their maidservants, and he makes the kids part of the 12 tribes of Israel?
It's a good question.
Yeah.
We don't have a great answer for it. Other than
I don't think Ishmael was born out of trust in the Lord to do what he said he was going to do.
Right.
When they take it in their own hands to reproduce and force the covenant and force the line, it seems like it has negative effects on those children. When we get to the 12 tribe things and the 2 wives, this wasn't a forcing of the covenant. This wasn't like somebody, like mom coming in and trying to.
Right.
Jealousy, right?
Yeah.
Jealousy,
I mean, we had the jealousy between the 2 sisters, but that wasn't really an issue of extending or populating. Because if you're going to be fruitful and multiply, and you're going to have a mighty nation, you're probably going to have to do it through more than having 2 kids per generation.
Sure.
I mean, you get these 12 sons, and now all of a sudden we're multiplying like crazy. But I do think there is a difference, like when you look at with Abraham and you look at Isaac, and you see Sarah trying to force something through another woman. That was not what the Lord intended. It's like, I'm still going to take care of this kid. I mean, he was really kind to Abraham. He's your son and I'll take care of him, but that's not what I was talking about. And you guys tried to force the covenant. You tried to force my will. Then we get to the next one, and even with Isaac and Esau, I think regardless of whether or not mom stepped in and did this, the Lord told him how it was going to do. And once again, mom's trying to help along, like not trusting that God said he was going to do what he was going to do.
Yeah.
And again, a sibling gets hurt out of that. So we're just seeing these offset kids because somebody has their idea of how they want to force what God said he was going to do, and he's not doing it in their timing, and he's not trusting him to do it the way he wants to do it. We'll do it for the Lord. And I just think you keep seeing these damaged relationships by people trying to do what the Lord said he would do.
Yeah.
Well, and you don't see Jacob or Rachel stepping in. I mean, it was 7 years with Leah. You know, he loved her, but he didn't like finagle or do something to make it happen before. He didn't follow the same.
Yeah, and there hadn't been like a prophetic word saying, okay, now the Lord never came to Jacob and said, your second kid will do, at this point in time, it was just, you're going to multiply.
Right. And point, because there is no prophecy of this, your firstborn son is going to be all this, because actually we find out the firstborn son does not get the blessing, but it's not because,
Nor does the second.
right, but that all comes later.
Yeah.
Like all the decision of how inheritance is divided and who's really considered the firstborn and who, all this stuff all happens later. It's not prophesied from the beginning. And I think another interesting, and I would have to go back and read the specific language because I might not be remembering it exactly correctly, but so with Abraham, so he has Ishmael with Hagar, and presumably, because the situation here, of course, is that Rachel, Leah has these 4 sons. Rachel doesn't have any. She's not able to conceive. So she gives her servant, but she raises those children. Rachel raises those children as her own. Whereas with the story with Hagar, it seems that Hagar is still raising Ishmael.
Yeah.
Sarah may have for a while, but remember there's also this jealousy between Sarah and Hagar that develops, which is why Hagar gets sent into the wilderness to die, basically, because she's jealous of her. Which that jealousy is not, there's competition between Rachel and Leah, but there's not jealousy and competition between the sisters and their servants. So, and that goes into this, why she says she has her servant have children, but it says in verse 3 of chapter 30, go to her and let her give birth on my knees so that I may also build a family. And so it's very clearly stated, like, she's like a surrogate, basically, So this is Rachel's child, which doesn't come off quite the same way in the Abraham story. So regardless, I mean, it's not that this is all without problem, but it is different, and it is interesting. But it's also interesting that the 2 servants, because of course Leah ends up doing the same thing, giving her servant, and again raising those children. I don't remember how many children. I forget how many children come from each one. Anyway, but raising those children as her own as well. But those 2 they're not like part of the matriarchs, right? We don't, the blessings on Shabbat over the children, maybe be like Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. It's not Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah, Bilhah, and what's the other one's name? Can't remember. And so,
Yeah.
And so there is a difference. And it is complicated, and our modern minds are like, I don't like this. This multiple wives thing is not a good idea.
Yeah.
God also doesn't think it's a good idea, by the way.
You also notice some of the major characters that came out of this.
Yeah.
Judah, Levi, they were from Leah.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we get Joseph, he actually came through Rachel.
Right.
And you do
and
see,
Benjamin.
Yeah, and Benjamin.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, and then you still see even though they were supposed to be one big cohesive, you still see the tension even when we get down to Saul and David. You've got the
Right.
tribe of Benjamin, so
Right.
you've still got this little bit of tension, like we didn't totally come together
Right.
cohesively. We still got the 2 sisters' families going on there.
Yeah. Which is partially, which we see even going back to this, because we see that with Reuben, right? That's how we get into this whole mandate situation.
Yeah.
So let's keep going. So Rachel is jealous of her sister. Jacob is mad at her for being jealous, which is interesting. But his response is actually maybe not terrible, because he says, am I instead of God the one who withheld from you the fruit of the womb? And so he's kind of feeling challenged of like, hey, it's not that I don't want you to have children. I'm not God. Which is actually not a bad response, especially in this narrative where we're understanding that God is the one who opens the womb. That for her to challenge him and say this is your fault is really actually not fair. So his response is really not so bad. So anyway, so then Rachel gives her servant and has 2 sons. Leah is still kind of caught in this rivalry, gives her servant, has 2 sons. So now, we get to this point in verse 14 that Reuben, of course, is going out in the fields and he finds mandrakes. And he knows enough, as the firstborn of all of these children, he's a little bit older, it seems, at this point, that he loves his mother, is the reality, and he feels sorry for her because he knows that she is unloved by her husband, and that's difficult. So he takes these mandrakes, and then this negotiation happens that Rachel gets the mandrakes in exchange for Leah getting Jacob that night, and but again, in God's determination, the mandrakes don't work, right? Because God is the one who opens the womb. But Leah does have yet another son. But then we get to verse 22, and God remembers Rachel and listened to her and opened her womb. And so, again, this is after all the mandrake stuff. So God is making a point that this superstition is not going to work for you, but I am going to see you and have compassion and mercy on you. And what's interesting is she has a son. She has Joseph. And what does Joseph's name mean?
You will add.
Yeah. So she has a son, and in naming him is asking for another one. Which is a little bold. It's like, you might think he's just, like, she would just be thankful that after all this time and all this heartache, she's gotten what she asked for. No, she's asking for another one, which, interestingly enough, and this is not in our portion this week, but what happens when she has her second son? She dies. So this thing that she thinks is going to give her all this meaning to life and make her life complete is actually what ends up taking her life, which is...
I think Jacob cursing her too.
Well, yes.
Accidentally cursing her.
Yeah.
She took the...
So anyway, so now we've reached this point. Rachel has her son. So now we have 11 of the 12, I believe, unless I miscounted. Yeah. I know we get 11 of 12 out of this portion, and Benjamin comes later. But so we have Jacob now has 11 sons and at least one daughter. We don't know if there are more daughters mixed in there or not, but at least one daughter. So he does have 12 children at least. And he's like, all right, it's time. So now he's asking Laban to let him go with his wives. And then we get into this negotiation with the flock, right? So, which is interesting because really what happens is, so Laban wants to just pay Jacob. Laban's like, what's your price? What do I need to pay you to get you, for you to be happy? Because Jacob's asking for his wages or inheritance or whatever, because he worked the 14 years, but then he's still there. So he's no longer working the bride price at this point. He's just working for Laban. So he's entitled to something. And it almost seems like he's like a servant at this point, but he's not. And I think Jacob is trying to remind Laban of that. Like, I'm actually not your hired slave. I'm your nephew and your son-in-law now. And I've played a part in building your wealth, in building your flock, in building all of these things. Not to mention I now have all these wives and children. So he asks for, he's asking for, and I think TLB just says the flock, but I think most people we talk about it as goats. I don't know if he specifically says goats in this. Oh yeah, he does say goats. He does later. So he's asking for these goats, and he's asking for the spotted ones, right? So actually the reality is he's actually not asking for a lot, because those are the rare ones. So he's just asking for a few. But this is where, Laban's comes out that he's like, he tries to hide them and all of these things, but then Jacob takes these rods, these branches, these certain colored branches, which again, this is really interesting too, right? Is that there's this is another superstition that the color or the type of branches that you put by these goats when they mate affects their color. Is very strange. But in this case, God kind of allows that to work, right? Because Jacob ends up with all these animals, and Laban's mad about it because he's like, "You tricked me," or whatever. And then Jacob's like,
It's the God of science, though, right? Even Yeshua, sometimes when he does miracles, he tells them he uses mud, he uses objects of faith, like because you do it, right?
So it's just kind of an interesting way that this comes about, but everything in how things come about in Genesis is kind of interesting. So, but anyway, so he ends up with all these animals, but now Laban's sons are mad because they're like, Jacob's taken everything that's supposed to be ours. He's taken our inheritance, basically. And this is an interesting thing. So it does seem that Jacob has a reasonable amount of favor with Laban up to this point, right? I mean, really, Jacob's helping make him wealthy, so you tend to like the person who helps build your wealth, right? Sure. So, but now that he wants to leave, we kind of see a different side. So in chapter 31, I'll just start in verse 1. So now Jacob heard the words Laban's sons were saying, Jacob has taken everything that belongs to our father, and from what belongs to our father he has made all these riches. Then Jacob saw Laban's face, and he noticed that his expression wasn't the same as it was just a day or two before. Then Adonai said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you. So Jacob sent and called for Rachel and Leah and to come to the field to his flock, and he said to them, I can see by your father's face that his expression isn't the same as it was just a day or two ago. But the God of my father has been with me. Now you yourselves know that I have served your father with all my strength, yet your father has fooled around with me and has changed my salary 10 times, but God hasn't allowed him to harm me. If he would say the spotted ones will be your salary, then the flocks would give birth to spotted ones. Or if he would say the striped ones will be your salary, then all the flocks would give birth to striped ones. So God has taken away your father's livestock and has given them to me. Now it happened when the flocks were in heat, and I lifted up my eyes and saw in a dream, behold, the males were going up to the flock were striped, spotted, and speckled. And then this is the section we read earlier where God kind of appears in this dream and reminds him that he is this God that he encountered previously with the Jacob's Ladder narrative. So Rachel and Leah are then on board with leaving. They're like, yeah, there isn't really anything left for us in our father's house. It says he has sold us, completely used up our bridal price. For all the riches that God has taken away from our fathers, for us and our children. So now everything God said to you, do it. And so this tells us a few things. It tells us that they understand the nature of their father and that he is not being fair. It also tells us that they understand that Jacob's God, the God of Israel, is working here and has power. However, we also find out that at least Rachel still gives still thinks that her father's gods are worth something because she steals his idols. There's some different theories about why she may have done this. Maybe she wanted him to not have them, to be able to worship, because she did believe in the God of Israel. But the likelihood is that, and Dennis Prager makes this point that's really good, is that because this actually still happens. So when you have a pluralistic religion that believes in multiple gods, even though they'll recognize the power of the God of Israel, that doesn't necessarily mean that they renounce all their other gods. It takes some time for that to happen. They just are like, we'll bring it in. And this is seen a lot still, even like among like Hindu culture. They'll accept the God of Israel, but then they still have all their other gods. And it's because that's how they're wired. That's how their brain works. It's like, yes, of course, there's all these gods, and if we see that one has power, of course we want to worship him too, but it doesn't necessarily immediately mean that you renounce all other gods. It's called syncretism. So we still see this happening, and so it's very likely that's what's happening with Rachel, is that she sees that Jacob's God is working, and is powerful. And of course, we know that she understands that it is God who opened her womb to have Joseph. But she may not be quite willing to give up her father's gods quite yet. So she takes them. When Laban comes after them, he's like, my idols are missing. They've got to be with you. She lies. Jacob is confident that they are not amongst his people, his family. But of course, Rachel is hiding them.
So confident, he said whoever has them will die.
Right. So then that's the potentially inadvertently cursing Rachel. So anyway, they continue. But Laban doesn't find them. And he kind of snaps at Laban a little bit. He's kind of like, which is kind of funny. Dennis Prager makes this is like the thing that makes him snap is actually the thing that Laban was right about. He just didn't know it. But in Genesis 31, verse 36, it says, Then Jacob got angry and argued with Laban. Jacob answered and said to Laban, What is my crime? What's my sin that you've hotly pursued me? For you felt through all my things, and what did you find? Any of your household things? Put them here in front of my relatives and yours so they can decide between the two of us. And he goes through to recount everything that he's done for Laban these past 20 years. So, and he also ends up recognizing that it is through God that he has been prosperous, because he says in verse 42, Had I not had the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac, you would have sent me away empty-handed now, but God saw the misery and toil of my hands, and last night he became the judge. So then he says, he basically makes this agreement with Laban, and they end up parting ways but on better terms, sort of. So anyway, there we have it. 20 years of Jacob leaving his mother, his family, going to Laban's family, accumulating all kinds of wives and children and flocks, and he's headed back to Canaan. And he is recognizing that God is who he said he was, and that God is doing what he said he would do at that encounter that we have at the beginning of the portion. So he is even stating at the very end of this portion that this is God's camp, that God has been present with them. So it's a lot of things. And of course we know, as kind of the pattern that's happening here, as this family that God has put his name on is growing, we're kind of getting to spend more time with them, because we'll continue with Jacob's family, and ultimately Joseph through the end, and then of course we end up in Exodus. Yeah.
Why do you think there's very little said about Isaac? It's just so short.
I know, it is really short. I don't know. His story, other than the whole situation of his, his sons and wife deceiving him about the birthright and the blessing, he seems to live kind of a quiet life. He is, again, he's the only patriarch who lives his entire life in the land. He never leaves, even to find a wife. That's why Abraham sends Eliezer to go find and bring back Rebecca, because he's like, my son has to stay here. So I don't know. So I don't know. He gets to live the good life, I guess, a little bit in the land. Yeah.
I kind of wonder if it's maybe because he was slightly traumatized by Daddy trying to kill him, hence becoming a mama's boy. And in the book of Jasher, which I know it's not canon, but it says that Abraham also favored, Jacob. So that's more of a father figure there. So did he just have so much PTSD and, not
Right.
good sight anyway, that he was just sheltered and a homebody?
Well, it had to have some kind of life.
Well, yeah, it
Yes.
was. So is there really that much to tell after, trauma?
Right. But the thing is also, and not that it wasn't traumatic, but most understand that Isaac was at least 13-ish.
Yeah, I was thinking.
He was a teenager
12-ish.
at least,
Yeah, but
when the binding happened, and so
Yeah,
he was aware,
Drawn on a slab.
and complicit.
Yeah.
Which doesn't necessarily make it less traumatic, but he wasn't being hoodwinked into the situation. He wasn't being fooled. He didn't fully know the reality because he does get there and say, Father, where's the sacrifice?
Yeah.
And then we find out that it's him. So, but at the same time, he also saw God intervene. Like, he was aware of God's intervention.
Deliverance.
Yeah.
Praise.
And I imagine that there was some working out of that. Again, I'm not saying it's not a traumatic experience.
But that whole why me question.
Yeah, but
comes with it.
But he's seeing, because at the same token, by that point, I think we could also assume that part of his upbringing had been Abraham recounting his visitations with God and the covenant that God made with him. Knowing that being raised knowing that he is the son that was prophesied, that this is going to be passed through. And then seeing God intervene and seeing, oh, God really did mean that. And my life is important and needed for God, for this covenant to pass through. So, yes, it's a difficult and traumatic situation, but I do think that Isaac also would have seen the power of God through it.
They're living lives. All the Old Testament people, the characters, are living lives that are shadows and types and symbols of all things that have to do with Yeshua and God's covenant. So I think in some measure the sovereignty of God is causing them to do the very things that they're doing, so that they could write it in Scripture and make a pattern for us.
For sure. So but it is interesting that Isaac's narrative is short. But I think that we can still see his obedience. But we do also see, and this is one thing that Jen Springer points out as well, is that he, of course, he has a favored son. Jacob's going to have a favored son. And playing favorites with children has some consequences as well. But that's also the nature of family, right? Like, you tend to, and the Genesis is a very human story. The Torah is actually a very human story, even though we see this divine supernatural intervention frequently. It's very much about the human condition, and showing that not always, but frequently we tend to carry on what we saw in our parents. Like, these things are generational, and we do tend to continue those. But the mercy of God is that he still shows up in the midst of that. And also, hopefully, we pray, he shows us what generational patterns we need to break as well. Because we do also know that generational curses are a thing, and that we need to be aware of that, and hopefully we can break some of those. But especially in this example of favoritism, if you grow up with favoritism, that probably is going to continue on through you. But God will still, there are things of God that can't be thwarted, which is reassuring. We're not more powerful than God. Praise the Lord. So Lord, we thank you for your word. We thank you for we thank you that you give us these stories to teach us about your character and about your faithfulness and about your covenant loyalty, Lord. And we just ask that you would just reveal to us the part that we are to play, and the way that we can represent you well and your character well, Lord. I ask that your presence would be with us in service, and throughout the rest of the day, Lord. I thank you that we get to have Shabbat, this time to feel you draw near in a greater way and be together to worship you.